Alright, now it's time to once again give you my list of what I personally think are the worst final bosses in video games. You might remember me doing a list of the worst final bosses 8 years ago, and I'm honestly not proud of it. So I felt that you guys deserve a more up-to-date version of the list. Now, there may be some bosses on here that you might happen to like, and if you do like it, there's nothing wrong with that. Just hear my reasons for calling these fights bad. And bear in mind, some of these entries are ones that I've already talked about before, so please forgive me if I sound like a broken record. So, I hope you enjoyed the revision to my top 10 worst video game final bosses. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is widely regarded as the hardest Zelda game ever, and I can definitely agree on that. The game, while decent, is just plain cheap, especially when you get to the last part. It's a long and overwhelmingly difficult road to the Great Temple, not helped by how the Great Temple itself is an absolute maze and has a lot of annoying enemies, and the bosses do not go down easy at all. Obviously we have the Thunderbird, but after that we have to deal with Dark Link, who is arguably worse. The first problem is that it's not even the game's villain, it just comes out of nowhere as some sort of pest. And the fight itself, this boss is everything we hate about Iron Knuckles in this game, with the way he constantly shields himself, making it really hard to hit him. That alone earns him the title of one of the most frustrating bosses in all of Zelda. And why wouldn't it be? And I don't want any of that wall trick argument, because that's a glitch. Defeating him without the usage of the glitch can prove to be a very aggravating experience. So good luck trying to do that! I'm pretty sure that when Pokemon Legends Arceus came out, we could all agree on one thing. Volo is just plain unforgiving. One fight with him will give you a great idea of where Cynthia inherited her cheap strategies from in the Sinnoh remakes. His team is full of high-level Pokemon, and he knows exactly when to switch between normal, strong, and agile moves, so he will use them when you don't want him to, so you will lose almost your entire team. And then, when you beat him, and it seems like you can finally rest, he then summons Giratina. I don't think I even need to explain how powerful that is. I mean, it's Giratina. Need I say more? You can bring both Dialga and Palkia to this fight, but you can expect that you'll be right on the brink of losing by the time you face Giratina. And then, even if you beat it, it's still not over, because it then transforms into its origin form and you have to beat it again. So yeah, that means that Volo basically has 8 Pokemon, dethroning both Greevil and Ghetsis as the trainer with the most Pokemon out of any trainer in the franchise. I will admit, the setup to this battle is pretty epic, with the way it mirrors Cynthia's boss fight. The foreshadowing of him being the villain was actually kinda clever without giving it away, even though I feel like they could have shown him do more evil things after the reveal, but that's besides the point. And I wouldn't mind taking on 8 Pokemon. I mean, I survived the Pokemon Leagues, but if his main team wasn't so cheap to deal with, that would make dealing with both of Giratina's phases much more bearable. It's no wonder so many people say this guy is even harder than Cynthia. Though, if I can be honest, even in spite of all that I said, I still found Cynthia to be the overall harder boss. I think the reason why is because this game's battles don't have nearly as many mechanics to them, so Volo can't use as many cheap strategies as Cynthia did. So if I thought Cynthia was harder, why do I think this one is worse? Well, that's because even though Cynthia's team was in my opinion harder overall, at least the only part of her fight that I could call terrible was the fight against her Milotech. And because Cynthia's best Sinnoh waifu, can't go wrong with that. This, on the other hand, is unpleasant all the way through. But the reason I hate the fight this much is because it's a painful reminder that I have lost a lot of faith in humanity. What do I mean? The plot twist of Volo actually being evil would have been a much more awesome plot twist for me if the internet wasn't full of morons who deliberately spoil this plot twist just because they think it's funny to do so. This makes me worry that no one cares about hiding spoilers from the recent games anymore. Up until this point, people have been doing a great job at hiding spoilers from recent games, but now that everyone's deliberately spoiling this, that legitimately scares me. And this fight is a very painful reminder of that, so that makes this boss even more unpleasant. It's not the reason why I hate this fight, but it's the reason why I hate it this much. So yeah, it's like Cynthia, but easier, but more annoying, if that makes any sense. And the idiots in the Pokemon fanbase make me hate it even more. But I do wonder how traumatized Cynthia would be if she found out that she was related to someone this evil. One thing that makes Fire Emblem Three Houses such a great game is the fact that, unlike in Fates, none of the routes in the game are the actual canon route, so you can regard whichever ending you want as the ending you choose. And they're all great in their own right, except for Silver Snow. Why? The title is a complete tease and a painful reminder that there are no snow theme levels in the game. Pretty much everything you could have done in this route would also be done in Verdant Wind, except better. The route is just too depressing now that you've lost Edelgard. You don't have any of the 3 house leaders with you, the Silver Snow symbol is much duller looking than the symbols of the other 3 routes, and the final boss can go burn in the Valley of Torment. Believe me, the fact that it's yet another dragon final boss in the Fire Emblem game is the least of our problems. The first problem with this boss fight is the fact that it comes right out of nowhere. The final boss of Verdant Wind was against the leader of those who slither in the dark, which granted were really dumb villains, but at least it still had build-up. And the final fights in Azure Moon and Crimson Flower were the fights to put an end to the war, as you were fighting against the leader of the opposing side that you spent half the game fighting against. Here, however, the war has already ended, those who slither in the dark were already destroyed, and what happens here is just the character you've been trying to save suddenly loses her mind and goes on a rampage, and I have to kill her. Yeah, pretty anticlimactic, isn't it? I guess it is kind of sad that we do have to kill Rhea, especially after she finally learned from her mistake, but I honestly felt more sad about the fact that we recently had to kill Edelgard. The next problem is the fight itself, which is a massive difficulty spike. This fight legitimately took me 3 days to beat, while most of the previous fights in the game didn't take me that long. Rhea constantly heals throughout the battle. This isn't too bad in the first part, but in the last part, you'll likely need to have her practically surrounded in order to have any hope of winning, especially with the barriers surrounding her, as well as Miracle on her last few health bars, granting her some really annoying odds of avoiding your attacks, on the easiest difficulty. That makes her constant healing an even bigger problem than it already was, especially with her ability to renew her armor grid. I will admit, this fight does have some strong points, such as its unique battle theme, and seeing how the members of the Church of Seiros actually understand that they have to kill Rhea for the greater good while still feeling bad about it. Heck, even Catherine and Cyril, the 2 most toxic of Rhea's followers, understand this. But overall, this fight is just more proof that Silver Snow has pretty much nothing unique about it except for the ability to marry Rhea. So unless Rhea is your waifu, or you want to make a list of the hardest Fire Emblem bosses, I'd say you could just skip this route and you wouldn't really miss anything. If you want to fight the Immaculate One, you could always just do that in the Crimson Flower route, except under much more epic circumstances. One thing that may surprise you about the Kirby series is that they actually seem to go all out with their final bosses, especially in the modern games. And even some of the older games seem to do what they could do with what they've got, which makes the final fight with Dark Matter and Dreamland 2 look even more inferior in comparison. It seems like they at least worked with what they could in terms of atmosphere, but didn't think about how boring the fight is. Unlike some of the final abilities in the other Kirby games such as the Star Rod, Triple Star, and Master ability, this is literally just the sword ability. Except, ooh, it's rainbow colored! Even though it doesn't even matter since this is for the original Game Boy, which doesn't have any colors. And besides that, it has an extremely short range, so you have to get way too close to hit him with it. Also, for a battle in the skies, your movement is so slow. That probably won't give you enough time to avoid his charge attack, and also makes the fight feel like it drags on forever. Especially because your attacks barely even lay a scratch on him. He does use some attacks that can be reflected back at him for more damage than the Rainbow Sword does, but that's still barely anything. And then his second form. The way you fight him while slowly descending towards the ground is literally just a ripoff of the Nightmare Orb from Kirby's Adventure, except boring because, once again, of the painfully short range of the Rainbow Sword, and because he uses reflectable attacks even less often. And if you get game over, you have to fight Possessed DDD before you can fight this guy again. Not worth the hassle of getting all the rainbow drops in order to unlock him. As I said in the revision of my Killjoys list, the bosses in the Xenoblade games are the part that I always dread. Because unlike most bosses in video games, these ones just feel like souped up enemies. Not to mention how confusing the gameplay mechanics are. And that's where Mallows from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 comes in. Like pretty much all Xenoblade bosses, his attacks that should be short range feel like they hurt you no matter where you are in the room, make me wonder if dodging even does anything. Maybe I'm just not very good at the game, but with how confusing the combat in the Xenoblade series is, can you blame me? Plus, he also has some attacks that are very likely to one-shot some of your party members. And you can only revive characters so many times without having to refill the party gauge, which isn't exactly an easy task, so you might not have a lot of help from your teammates for most of the battle. But the worst part is that if you can't beat him in a certain amount of time, he uses his ultimate attack, Prometheus, which cannot be avoided, and it takes out your entire party in one hit. So yeah, you're basically on a time limit. Not that facing a boss in the time limit is always a bad thing, but at the very least, show the time limit so we know how much time we have. And it's not helped by how he has so much health that even when I was at the same level as him, that still wasn't enough to beat him in time. And even the enemies in the room before you fight him, while they're a great way to level grind at first, fighting them gets really dull after a while, and eventually it'll take a while to level up even with them. I wouldn't have that problem if it wasn't so easy to get to that point. This boss fight is at level 70, and I had to level grind to level 92 before I finally beat him. I don't know why I even bothered, since this boss fight is just a mess. Ugh, I thought I had finally broken this curse of not having to talk about Yoshi's New Island's final boss anymore. But no! It turns out I have to talk about it yet again in this list. It literally feels like this franchise is trying to ruin the original Final Fight with how every new installment keeps ripping off the original's final boss, except they make them less and less intimidating as they go on. But at least the others try to do something unique with them, but this on the other hand doesn't. It literally just copy-pastes the original final boss, except with minor differences, with some of those differences actually taking away the unique aspects of the original, such as ground pounding the floor to send ripples across the platform to hurt him, and how you had to beat him before you got too close, destroying your platforms. Yep, those two aspects are gone now. I just don't understand. Why are they trying to ruin the original? That's inexcusable. I mean, you can't ruin the original Final Fight, but this genuinely feels like it's trying to. Oh right, there are two more phases to this fight, which are okay, and actually keep me from hating this ending more than I already do, but they don't make up for the atrocity of the first two phases of the fight, and I have no idea why this franchise feels the need to keep insulting the original. The final bosses in the Donkey Kong Country games are just so boring, with the only exception being DKC3's final boss, because at least it has the electric floor gimmick. Aside from that one, there's almost nothing interesting about them, because they're literally nothing but running back and forth, avoiding near impossible to avoid attacks in a small battlefield and waiting for your chance to attack, which wouldn't have gotten this tiresome if they didn't take so many hits to beat. How do people not get tired of this? Easily the worst of them all in my mind is the final fight with King K. Rool in Donkey Kong Country 2. And yes, I am aware that he's not the true final boss, but he is the final boss of the main game, so I think it's okay to include him this time. As I was saying, this is the worst one because at least in the modern ones you could have enhanced jumping, not to mention the part where the platforms shoot up into the air in Tropical Freeze. That was kinda neat, and the final boss in the original, while long and annoying, wasn't as long as he is here. Not only that, but he can even freeze you and reverse your directions, and when he does his dash attack, he's way too fat to jump over. And remember that stupid trick he did when he pretends to be defeated only to get back up? Yeah, now he does that twice instead of once. I guess it wasn't that bad at first. After dozens of times losing to this overgrown lizard, all it does is prolong this already long boss fight. I haven't reached the game's true final boss, but since it doesn't look like it takes nearly as long, I highly doubt it's as bad as this one. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I don't like Sonic 2 as much as I should. I mean, I don't hate it, but sometimes I'm almost tempted to. Why? Mainly because of the lack of a save option. I understand it's a really old game and all, so of course it wouldn't have a save feature, but Super Mario World has a save feature and it existed first, so what's their excuse? This wouldn't have dragged the game this far down for me if you didn't have to go through 20 levels without saving. At least the Mario games had warp zones to cut the amount of time it took to get back to where you left off. This, however, doesn't. Unless you use a cheat code, which takes about a minute to put in, by the way. The lack of a save feature is especially a problem when you reach the game's final boss, the Death Egg. Yep, another unpopular opinion from me. What else is new? The first problem with the fight is, as many people have pointed out before me, Robotnik runs just as fast as Sonic. Why? This makes it way too easy for everyone to make those claims about how Sonic being the fastest thing alive is all a bunch of bogus, and I'm sick of hearing everyone say that. And then the boss itself. First off, its design is not very inspiring for a final fight. I mean, I know it's obviously supposed to look like a giant Robotnik, but I still wish we had a more inspiring design. And the music in the background is actually really grating, which is one of the reasons I'm using a fan-made version of it. The boss is made even worse by the fact that the stage doesn't have any rings in it, meaning that one slip up and you die. This wouldn't be so bad if you didn't have to time your attacks almost perfectly. You have to hit him in the stomach, but his hands have spikes on them, and you have to wait for the right time, so you have less than a second to hit them. And if you lose to him, you have to fight Metal Sonic again, which isn't exactly an easy boss either. And yet they felt the need to have this boss be the final fight in the second movie. It's a bad sign when the best things I can say about this boss are fan-made videos about it. Oh, and the worst part? As I've said before, if you get game over on him and don't know the level select code, you have to start the entire game all over again. This boss can go eat rotten eggs for all I care. Mother Brain from the original Metroid. Yeah, this was an inevitable choice, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like it'll be the last time I have to talk about it. This fight has literally nothing good about it whatsoever that I can think of. It's literally just you standing in one place rapidly firing missiles while you're being constantly bombarded with Rinkas and bullets, which you almost certainly won't be able to avoid because of how little space there is and how busy you are shooting missiles to notice. And they'll very likely knock you into the lava, which both damages you and hinders your movement, making jumping out of it even more annoying. Combined with boring music and uninspiring boss design, your brain will be much more damaged than this one. And if this boss wasn't terrible enough, Nintendo, for whatever reason, just had to have this boss die with a constantly flashing white light that will give people seizures. Which I'm not going to show because I don't want you guys to get seizures, but that's still inexcusable. Would you believe me if I told you that Metroid Dread managed to do this boss fight correctly? Because in that game, there's much more room for you to move around, making it nowhere near as horrible as this. This is just one of the absolute worst bosses ever made, and it baffles me that it's only number 2 on the list. Before we get to number 1, I'm going to list off some honorable mentions. Data Roxas from Recoded. Now you know what would have been number 11 on the list, because this boss feels random and is a cheap difficulty spike. Dark Mind from Amazing Mirror. Pretty epic fight, and it does get pretty intense during the 5th phase, until the last phase where the atmosphere, background, and music become much less threatening. When I heard that you can fight this boss during the credits, that made me especially excited to play this game. And when I actually got to the credits phase, you can imagine how disappointing that was for me. Death Egg from Sonic Forces. When will this franchise stop ripping off the final fight from Colors? Gigas from Earthbound. Not bad until the last phase, where the game deceives you into thinking your perms won't work anymore, and that you have to fight them like normal despite having outrageous HP and the annoying looping music and seizure-inducing background. The only thing keeping it from being on here is that I did learn that your perms do still work. Voldemort from Goblet of Fire. I guess the idea of a rhythm-based final boss isn't a bad idea, but because the only other rhythm segment in the game is the dance, it actually feels like you're defeating Voldemort with dance moves.
You haven't seen the last of me, Crash Bandicoot.
Guys, let's be real. If you've been a fan of me for the past 5 years, who else could it be? It's the final boss of Mario & Luigi Dream Team, also known as Dreamy Bowser. So let's discuss what makes this boss fight so terrible. First of all, this would have been a much more inspiring fight if Phantasma was the final boss, since he was a cool Bat King of Nightmares who terrorized the land in the past. But instead our fight is against the same guy who has been the main villain in almost every game ever since 1985. And has gotten very stale at times by this point in the franchise. So seeing him steal the title of a main villain from a fresh and new villain like Phantasma is just downright insulting. Especially since it was actually kinda cool seeing that Bowser actually respected another villain for once, only for it to turn out, nope, all of that was a lie. Another thing that would have made it better for Phantasma to be the final boss is because most of his attacks look much more menacing than Bowser's attacks in this fight, especially trapping you in nightmares with torture devices. How is that not intimidating? And then we see Bowser flipping coins and chowing down on a bunch of meat during the finale, which, needless to say, is a huge downgrade from that. I mean, come on, he has the power of the Dreamstone, which can allow him to do anything, and they have him do this? And then when he summons his minions, which is also not a very inspiring move since it's just rainbow versions of common enemies, he summons way too many of them, and every turn you spend fighting them, Bowser will continue to heal until you beat all of his minions. So unless you got the Z-Egg, which requires you to rescue all of the Pillow Folk, which are already annoying to find, you probably won't be able to beat all of them before he restores too much health. And he will also grab one of the brothers, meaning you can't use your brother's attacks until he throws said brother, forcing you to constantly mash the button in order to catch up with him. But you have to mash the button at the correct rate, for every time you miss, Luigi will take more and more damage. At least the music sounds like an epic final boss theme, but that actually makes this fight impossibly worse than it already is. It's extremely jarring in contrast to the stupid boss fight it plays in, and it's literally the most wasted song I have ever heard. This could have been one of the most epic songs in all of Mario, and maybe even one of the most epic final boss themes in all of gaming. But because all it does is make me think of this boss, the song isn't anywhere near as awesome as it could have been. You'd think that after going through a game that takes probably about 40 hours to beat would have a rewardingly awesome final fight, but then again, since most of those hours are pointless filler, I guess that makes sense. But even World of Light had a pretty rewarding finale, making having to sit through all the pointless filler throughout the mode, well, almost worth it. I don't hate the game overall, but I'm really tempted to at times, especially with how horrendous this fight is. While the gameplay in this fight isn't as bad as the gameplay in the fight with Mother Brain, everything else in the fight is enough to make me hate this boss more overall. And it is in my mind the worst final boss I have ever faced.